Ever interested in knowing what's in your cannabis sample? Well, today we're not just going to look at one or two samples. We're going to look at 840 tests that have been done in duplicate by NAFS, an accredited laboratory with SAHPRA, one of two. And essentially, we're not just going to be looking at potency, we're going to be looking at heavy metals, we're going to be looking at an array of tests that are being done on these samples. And specifically, we're also going to highlight things that go into a testing laboratory, like validation of methods, how to prepare a sample accurately for the lab. What does a randomized sample look like? What is the moisture content? How does that impact your tests? So if you're interested in knowing a lot more about South African testing, lock in for the next half an hour, as we're really going to dig into an interview covering testing in South Africa.
Ready?
So, Henrik, it's awesome to have you on today. I saw your presentation at the Cannabis Expo that highlighted very intriguing results, a first for South Africa in terms of like published material. And I'd like you to perhaps take us through some of those results today.
Thank you, Jeff. It will be my pleasure, and thank you for having me today and for giving me the opportunity to share some results, and maybe we can reach a broader audience.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna basically start off with, for those who don't know, I'm gonna basically start off with who NAFS, who we are, and we're a privately owned facility. We offer testing of various types. We've been in operation for about 4 years now. We are SAHPRA accredited, and we service different industries. So our main focus at this point is most probably pharmaceutical, forensics, and the cannabis industry, which kind of falls under pharmaceutical as well. And we've been testing cannabis-based products for more than 3 years at this point. Yeah. So I'm going to basically go into the sample load that we've tested. I think it's 840 samples we've tested in duplicate. That is 1,600 runs basically. That we've run, and we've kind of published the data. So first of all, when we receive a sample, we will put it into a certain category. So edibles is any food stuff that you ingest, like your gummies or pizza. So we've had a couple of edibles. Then extracts is a sample that you prepare in a way to up concentrate your cannabinoids. So from a raw plant material, I'm up concentrating or trying to up concentrate my cannabinoids. And infusion is something where I would put the raw plant material into a carrier medium and try and extract some cannabinoids. Usually they don't up concentrate. So I'm just trying to extract some. Your goal is to get it to extract all of the cannabinoids, but usually that's not the case. And then a liquid is a final product where you prepare it from either, I would say, an isolate or a FICO or something like that, where I've got a carrier medium and I'm adding an extract or a concentrate into that carrier medium to get a certain dosage, to get it to a certain concentration. And then obviously we've got plant material that everybody knows, and solids, mostly your isolates.
And I'm going to jump in here with a question. I mean, it's important you break this down into different categories because sample preparation is different for different platforms. And if you don't get the sample prep
Yes.
right, different labs might just apply like one rule to everything, and that's not the right way to go about it. You've got to deal with some things require dilution, some require harmonization before dilution. So I'm glad you've broken it down into the different categories.
So what I can So this is not the international accepted standard. This is an in-house definition that we give to samples to push it into a certain type of sample preparation.
Yeah.
Edibles, for example, you'll have a huge weight of sample with a very small concentration of cannabinoid. So you're consuming a couple of grams of pizza or a whole pizza, which is quite a large weight, but you're trying to consume 20 milligrams of CBD. So it's sometimes the limits are quite low to detect, if you think about it that way.
Yeah, perfect.
So going forward, this is basically what we've seen from what we received. So this data, this is the published data. I can tell you that plant material has definitely increased. So at this point in time, for a couple of months now, we've seen, I don't know if I would put plant material and extracts at an equal rate, but they're very close to one another. So this data, or well, the data that we've gathered in previous years will maybe look a little bit different in future. But this is what we've seen for those 840 samples, and it's mostly extracts. We've got a lot of infusions. We've got infusions has definitely come down lately, and then we've got a lot of liquids and plant materials.
Yeah, but that's awesome. It's good to see that people who are actually doing extracts at home are being considerate enough to go and test the samples and see what's there in terms of the results. And I'm glad to see that flower is improving, because there's definitely a lot to be said about the testing around flower. Yeah.
Yes, I think as the SAHPRA approved farms come online, we are receiving a lot more flower.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna from here jump into the first test that we performed, and that's obviously a potency analysis or a cannabinoid assay. So what this does is it gives you an indication of your cannabinoid concentration. What I should say is this is a quantitative analysis. We'll talk about that still later in the slide. So it's important to obviously know which strains you're cultivating. So you test it to determine your strain. You test it to monitor your harvest cycling. I don't need to tell you why you need to test it. You obviously know more than we do from a manufacturing or a cultivation side point why you would like to test it. From our point, it basically, for the public, it gives doctors an accurate dosage to prescribe to patients. So yeah, that's quite important.
No, perfect.
So if we look at the potency data from the 840 samples, 72% of all samples had a THC percent weight that was larger than CBD percent weight. So in the current market where CBD is kind of legalized, this is surprising to see, and only 28% of the samples had a CBD concentration higher than THC. Obviously, what I should mention as well is that the samples we receive are not necessarily from products that are on shelves. They are also included in the sample set, but it's basically a sample from wherever. So it can be private use, it can be importers, it can be cultivators. We just pulled all the samples. So this is not necessarily what you will find on shelves, but what you find on shelves is also included in this sample set.
So I'm going to jump in here. I mean, now it's become a lot easier for people to approach Section 21 application, where a customer might get a legal flower or they may get a legal extract through Section 21, which would correlate with these type of results. However, this is a strong indication that, to a large extent, a lot of illicit operators have been considerate enough to go to testing to know what's in their product. So I can say that, it's one where at least people are testing, and the need, that pushing for testing is just going to benefit the industry. So thanks for this.
Yeah, definitely. So the next slide is just a little bit of a further breakdown of what we've seen. So if I break down my THC concentrations into basically, and CBD concentration into two groups, above 0.1% and below 0.1%, 60% of all samples had a THC above 0.1 and only 10% below 0.1. And then for CBD, 25% above 0.1 and only 5% below 0.1. So basically 60% of my THC samples is exceeding the current legal limit. But as you said, you can get Section 21 permits, and this is also not disregarding the private use or private consumption.
Yeah.
That is kind of decriminalized currently. Yeah.
No, awesome. Fantastic. Great to see.
Okay. And then, so just what this slide I've put in here, because in the industry, you've seen that people don't really know the difference between a quantitative test or a qualitative test. And a lot of the times people would say, but my purity is good. And purity is usually a qualitative test. So what would happen is they would inject that sample onto an HPLC, for example, and they would integrate all the peaks, and you get a percentage peak area ratio rather than a quantitative cannabinoid concentration. So if we look at that, it's basically using a library match. There's no calibrations, there's no controls, there's no method validation for that. It's cheaper, and a percentage area is reported. I think the percentage kind of confuses people a little bit, but it's not the same unit as a quantitative test. Also, anything that is not amenable to LC analysis, so anything that you cannot see with a detector, is not taken into consideration. So for a quantitative test, you need to, we purchase a certified reference material from international vendors that is certified at a certain concentration of cannabinoid. So if I purchase this material, I know I've got 1 milligram of THC per milliliter of methanol. And we use that to calibrate the instrument. We inject controls every 10 injections. That test method is validated. So we look at repeatability between analyst, between instrument, within day, between day. We look at our working standard stability. So we would prepare a working standard. We would inject it every couple of days and look at the degradation over time. We look at matrix repeatability. So if we spike matrix, how repeatable can we analyze that specific matrix? There's a lot that goes into method validation.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here as well.
Expensive.
Yeah, it is expensive. And this is an important point. I mean, this is what people don't see, is that when you run a method and you validated a method, it takes firstly a lot of time to validate. The equipment is expensive because obviously you got an HPLC and you're also using a GC-MS. And we can talk about that in terms of like why one uses one and why it uses the other. But the other thing is like that 10-run injection and the fact that you're also assessing the degradation of your reference standard. A reference standard is only as good as its ability to be accurate because you're spending quite a lot on those reference standards, and it's good that you're assessing the viability of that standard and its strength on the shelf once it's put into dilution. So for me, this is exactly what we want to see. We want to see labs do this, and this also explains why you've received your SAHPRA accreditation for testing in this space, because you're going through that entire process of checking, the coefficient of variation, the linearity, the precision, the rest. So it's really good to see this, and this is very different to a home user who's listening, where a qualitative, just dropping a sample into a test tube and shaking it. That will never be. It will give you an indication. It will give you some kind of qualitative result, but you'll never really be able to go and say it's quantitative. Even NIR, there's potential for its use, but again, the deviation is what you've got to look at. Is that percentage of deviation changes? And I'm also glad you're looking at the difference between operators and analysts, because that can also lead to deviation, and that needs to be checked from an in-house standpoint. So I'm happy with what you've just communicated. Yep.
Okay. Great.
Awesome.
So what we've also looked at on a different sample set is residual solvents for the extracts. Obviously, for your plant material, you can't measure residual solvents, but because we have received a lot of extracts, we look at the solvents and what is currently failed, and what are the biggest culprits. And it currently seems that the biggest culprits are ethanol, isopropanol, and acetone, and these are easily acquired off the shelf. And basically 30% of all samples failed.
It's crazy. It's quite, and it's, it's something you can purge. Like theoretically, look, the ppms, the parts are quite stringent, but this is the one thing. I'm glad people are testing for it. Firstly, because it tells them that the method to clean up your sample still requires work, and I hope that every operator uses this as information. Yeah.
And what we've seen is, as you evaporating your solvents, your bulk becomes more viscous, and it gets harder and harder to get the solvent out of that viscous. It's like it's trapping the solvent, basically. So it's not releasing the solvent that's bubbling. It's kind of trapping it because it's so viscous and hard.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I should also notice with the ethanol, you should definitely check your ethanol that you employ, that it's either food grade, because ethanol that you purchase off the shelf would either have denaturants or some sort of closed boilers to ethanol in there, so that it's kind of an industrial grade ethanol that they don't have to pay tax on. But there's stuff in there that is more dangerous than your class 3 solvents. So there would be a class 2 solvent like a benzene or xylenes or something like that in there to deter people from drinking it.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump in here just to explain quickly as well, because basically there are two different rates. There's a very competitive rate for ethanol when it's industrial application, and then there's food grade. And what happens is manufacturers, to avoid tax on that ethanol, they introduce something like benzene into the product, which then makes it not fit for human consumption. So that ethanol is meant for industrial purposes, cleaning, certain industrial applications, and not to be sold and used when making an extract. There's a reason vodka costs more, and the people don't want you using food grade ethanol because you compete with the liquor industry. So because of those tax tariffs, it's really important to check the quality of your ethanol, and that's an important point you bring up there, because it's not easy to separate or to fractionally distill certain similar boiling points off. So fully great point, and that's something home users, be careful about your ethanol.
Yes. And another point here, a case that we've had is one client telling us that his alcohol is all natural. It's been distilled from honey. He makes it himself. And if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to introduce other ketones and methanol into your mix as well, because your bacteria or whatever's fermenting that honey is not only producing ethanol. There's other components in there as well. So you basically need to know what you're doing and get it tested before you start using it.
Yeah, absolutely. We know methanol can lead to blindness as an extreme example, but still it's an example. So, last thing anyone, and I think a lot of people do this for home use and maybe for friends, the intention is good. And we don't want silly things end up just because of a lack of chemistry, and everyone's not supposed to understand chemistry and biochemistry, but we want to highlight the importance of good solvents. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so moving on from the solvents, this is quite a scary one. So we've tested heavy metals, and we tested against two limits. So your USP, ICH, European Pharmacopoeia, they've got different routes of administration. So there's usually an oral, a parenteral, an inhalation limit. Nobody at this point injects cannabis type of product. So we only looked at oral and inhalation limits. And for the inhalation limit, it is a more stringent limit because it enters the bloodstream directly. And 44% of all samples failed. And what is more concerning is a lot of the, especially like your mercury and your lead, they are class 1 solvents. So they are the most dangerous, class 1
heavy metals.
Yeah. So they are the most dangerous metals. Nickel is a class 2, so it's not a class 1, but You don't want two of your top three metals that fail to be in class 1.
Yeah.
That's scary. And if we look at the oral limit, it looks a little bit better. You've got a 15% failure rate, but again, two of our top three is lead and arsenic, which is a class 1 heavy metal. So it is dangerous. And what I should also mention here is a lot of there's a misconception about how heavy metals gets into my cannabis. So I had a discussion with a client once, and he told me that he doesn't plant his cannabis next to a nuclear power plant, so there's not going to be any heavy metals in his cannabis. And you should remember that cannabis is what they call a phytoremediator. So they would plant it, and it will basically take all the heavy metals from the soil, from the ground and your water, and bioaccumulate those heavy metals. The same with sunflowers, and that's something to consider. Your soil, surface waters, any runoff from factory, any emissions from cars, all of that can influence your heavy metal content. And when I harvest this cannabis and I dry it, because it's a weight-dependent analysis, the more I dry it, the more I up-concentrate these heavy metals in my final bud. So it is definitely something to consider.
Yeah, and it's something I'd say they don't think of giving so what I can see people doing is they'll dry for their potency testing, they'll make it as dry as possible because then you get a higher THC or CBD count. And then for metals, they might give you wet material to try to downplay the metal testing.
Yes.
Now that's obvious.
Yes.
I mean, I know any proper testing facility will know. So it should be that the same is used for potency and for metals so that you're getting a realistic explanation of what's happening with the material. And you write about it can be anything. It could be the water. It could be the legacy of the land. If that land was very close to mining activities, and we know Africa has a lot of mining activities, you've got to really check for it, because not just for international sales, but for even local use. I mean, it's good to see that the edibles are safer to an extent, and but the inhalation limits are a lot more stringent. But there's ways of getting around it. All around the world, the quality of cultivation of cannabis is improving, and people are paying attention to the heavy metals, because you don't want to take something potentially that you feel is good for your health, and then you're introducing an element like heavy metals that degrades your health over time. So no, thank you for sharing that.
No, exactly. So let's try and keep everyone safe, and so lastly, I don't know, this is kind of a slide of questions that we kind of receive a lot, and a little bit of a lack of understanding of what's involved with this. So there are two major issues that we've seen, and the first is proper representative sampling, which I will explain, and then homogeneity of your product. Those are two big major issues that we've seen. So currently the WHO has got a guideline for herbal medicines, and they are of the opinion that if you have a herbal medicine or produce a product from a herbal medicine, you should consider your batch as non-homogeneous. So they don't care if it's produced under EU GMP or under GMP manufacturing guidelines. They are of the opinion that you should consider that batch non-homogeneous. So basically, you'll get your concentration distribution of cannabinoids within your batch is not the same everywhere. So what we've seen is, if I would sample an extract syringe from the start, middle, and back, the concentration of cannabinoids would differ. Even if I sample isolates, you get a difference in concentration from certain spots. So if you are to sample and send that sample to us, if I take one bud from a crop, that is not representative of your entire crop. The WHO recommends either you sample 10% of your crop, which is a lot because it's non-homogeneous, or you sample according to the R plan that you see there at the bottom. That's 1.5 times the number of square root of the number of plants that you've got, which is also a lot.
Yeah.
And that's the extent that they go to give the laboratory a representative sample. And we've had a lot of discussions and debates with clients about homogeneity of batches and so forth. And these products are just not homogeneous. And it's internationally accepted that they're not going to be homogeneous. And that's why we run a duplicate at least to get an average of your batch.
No, absolutely. It makes complete sense. I mean, this is challenging. Like, at the end of the day, if you are in a commercial sense, you've got to make sure that you've got something representative. So it can't just be your best colas, it can't just be popcorn buds. You've got to make an even distribution, take randomized samples. And, you know, this brings me to the point, which is also one of, like, I always hear this debate and argument from the industry, which is I can send the same sample to 4 labs and I get different results. And here's the reality of it is there are going to be labs that are going to be better at giving you an accurate representation of your sample based on, firstly, what we've discussed, validation of methods, proficiency testing that's going to still come into the space. But this is what I hope to see is on a PT scheme, proficiency testing. I hope that we will see more involvement from the regulator, sending a sample, like almost like a SANAS body that is sending the same sample and getting every, let's say, 3 or 4 main labs to give a similar, within the deviations, a similar result. And I think this is what everyone's fighting toward, working toward. I do think with the hemp regulation now coming into effect, that this will be required because prosecution could be the result of testing. So therefore, it's going to be far more closely looked at and hopefully more supported because I do think that labs need more support from government in terms of also not just funding, but also from permitting. I assume you guys are completely self-funded as a testing lab. These are the kind of things we want to see from, you know, if we're going to develop the industry, we need to develop support for testing in the industry because you cannot regulate an industry you cannot test.
Yes, exactly. So we have reached out to SAHPRA to try and build something like that, a relationship where we can kind of help one another just to because if you don't know what you're confiscating or what people are producing, how can you enforce regulation, as you said? So that would be a nice step forward if we can start working together.
Yeah, perfect. Henrick, I want to thank you for your time. I know that we try to keep this one to under 30 minutes. I know that we're going to be touching base a lot more with discussions about the industry, maybe even looking more into the actual testing equipment, you know, the differences between a HPLC and a GC-MS. But I just wanted to thank you for your time and any last words to any of the consumers out there in terms of, you know, I think it's valuable that you test your products and know what's in it because it's going to improve quality. And we've got to self-regulate as an industry to a large extent as well.
Yes. I completely agree with that. And I would just basically like to say thank you to everyone who is testing and everyone who is keeping the industry a safer place.
Awesome. Fantastic. Appreciate your time and good luck to NAFS going forward into 2022.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
Pleasure. Cheers.
Cheers, eh? Bye.
Now, if you found that interview on testing useful and instructive and are passionate about knowing more, go have a look at a conversation I had in Mexico presenting on international testing standards as well as manufacturing standards that you can find in the channel.